They said I'd be just visiting. I heard those words, and though they weren't spoken with cruelty, they weighed heavily on me, like a mantle I hadn't asked for. I'm not sure they realized what they were doing. It's funny, isn't it, how some of the most devastating things can be said in such a calm, even pleasant tone. They never said goodbye, never looked me in the eye when they left. They told me to wait in the lounge, that it would be just a short while. And I waited. I waited 8 hours. I'm 79. I live in a small, quiet apartment now, though I wasn't always alone. There was a time when my home was full of voices, of life, of the kind of noise that fills up a house with children and guests, and the hum of activity. I remember when I would sit at the kitchen table and my children would run in and out. My husband would complain about his day at work, and everything felt so normal, so alive. But those days are behind me now. It all started with what seemed like an innocent trip. A family vacation, they called it. Something to take my mind off the years that had passed so quickly, to remind me that I still belonged. I packed carefully, methodically, as I always do. 3 days before the flight, I laid out all my clothes, arranged them by day, like I used to when my son was a child, preparing for his school trips. I was a mother then, and I was a grandmother now, though it seemed the roles were starting to blur. I had to adjust to new realities, new expectations. I had to make space for their lives, their needs, and somehow shrink mine to fit into the corners they left me. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, had insisted on matching T-shirts for everyone. It was a silly thing, but I wore it because it mattered to her. Mine said, "Vacation Nana," in big pink letters. I didn't like it. The words felt like a reminder of how I didn't belong to myself anymore, how I was someone else's addition to a picture. But I didn't argue. I wore it. After all, who was I to challenge a trip that was supposed to make me feel included? Adam, my son, barely spoke to me as we went through security. His eyes were downcast most of the time, his mind elsewhere. Lisa seemed distracted too, her face pulled tight with that same nervous smile she wore when she was trying to keep things in control. I noticed she kept glancing at her watch, and Adam remained unusually quiet. The kids, of course, were absorbed in their phones, barely acknowledging me. It felt strange, this sudden distance. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it harder. There was always this unspoken agreement, wasn't there? That my place in their world, however small, was enough. At least, that's what I told myself. But when we finally passed through security, and Lisa turned to me with that same brittle smile, something inside me twisted. "Mom, why don't you stay here in the lounge for a bit?" she said, her voice so calm, so patient. "We'll go ahead to check in the bags, sort the kids' boarding passes, and then come get you. Just relax. You've done enough." That last sentence hung in the air between us like a shadow. You've done enough. Not an accusation, not a question, just a statement, a quiet dismissal. I nodded. Of course I did. That's what you do when your son gives you an instruction in that clipped, over-patient voice, the one reserved for the elderly, the confused, and the inconvenient. So I sat. I sat where they told me, next to a dusty potted plant, between a crying toddler and a flickering television tuned to a weather channel. The hours passed. It was 9:15 a.m. when I first sat down, and the day drifted by with the slow, painful rhythm of waiting. After an hour, I stood and paced near the window, the light outside starting to shift, growing softer as the hours wore on. After 2 hours, I asked the clerk at the front desk to page Adam. No response. The minutes bled into hours, and the lounge started to empty. People came and went, flights were announced, and then departed. I became part of the furniture, unnoticed, as insignificant as the dust settling on the corners of the room. At 5 p.m., I finally asked the clerk to help me. I gave Adam's full name. She typed it into the system, hesitated, and then glanced at me carefully. She said it slowly, kindly, as though she were speaking to a child. They checked into the 1:45 p.m. flight to Honolulu. Ma'am, it's already departed. I remember the moment clearly, though it wasn't a shock. I knew. I always knew. This wasn't a mistake. Not a mix-up. They left without me. I wasn't a priority anymore. Not by accident, not out of carelessness, but because they didn't care enough to check. They didn't care enough to notice that I wasn't with them. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't a grandmother. I was just the old woman who was left behind. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I couldn't. There was no energy for that. I just walked to the restroom, locked the stall, and sat down. Not to cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't have the strength for it. I just needed to be somewhere where no one would ask if I was okay. I sat there, quietly, letting the time pass, letting the knowledge of what had happened sink into my bones. When I emerged, the airport had shifted into evening mode. The buzz had dimmed, the hum of activity quieted. I walked to the departure screen, a numbness settling over me. I didn't rush. I didn't hurry. I simply stared at the list of destinations, like someone trying to make a choice at a diner. That's when I saw it. Portland, 7:35 p.m. For some reason, I knew that was where I needed to go. Maybe because I hadn't been there in decades. Maybe because it was where I once learned to ride a bike. Maybe because it was the furthest thing from Hawaii, and I had no interest in paradise anymore. I was done with pretending. I was done with being a prop in someone else's life. I needed to go somewhere real, somewhere I could start again. I walked to the counter, bought a one-way ticket, and took the next flight out. No one asked me why I was traveling alone. No one looked at my shirt, the one that said, "Vacation Nana." I had taken it off and tossed it in the trash long before reaching the gate. When I boarded the plane, the city lights of Wilmington fell away beneath me, and with them, so did the weight of everything that had led me to that point. The family, the sacrifices, the years of being the silent, obedient one. I was going to Portland, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Not because I had anywhere specific to go, but because I wasn't tied to anything anymore. I had nothing left to prove, nothing to hide. I didn't know what I would find in Portland, but I knew I had to go. I had to go because I was done with waiting. And for the first time in years, I felt the flutter of something inside me. Hope, maybe. It was enough. I stepped off the plane in Portland around 10 p.m. My feet sore from hours of travel and the weight of a decision I hadn't fully understood until now. The air here felt different. Crisp, damp, the kind of cool that sticks to your skin even through layers. It smelled like earth, like rain-soaked concrete and pine trees, like something I hadn't known I was missing. I hadn't been to Portland in years. The last time I was here, I was a young woman, full of hope and belief that life would bend to my will. I was so sure then, so naive, thinking that if I worked hard enough, if I loved enough, everything would fall into place. But nothing had really fallen into place, had it? As I walked through the terminal, I felt the weight of my life settle around me like an old, heavy coat. No one was waiting for me. No one had called or checked in. My phone had been turned off for the whole flight, and when I checked it just before I left Wilmington, There were no messages from Adam or Lisa. No texts asking if I was okay or where I was. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't new. It was the kind of silence I'd learned to live with. The silence that filled the spaces where words were never spoken. It was the kind of silence I had grown used to over the years, and I had learned to let it wash over me like a steady tide, unrelenting and cold. I made my way to the taxi stand, keeping my eyes forward, not wanting to make eye contact with anyone. I didn't need anyone to see me. Not tonight. Not in this city where everything was new and strange, where the buildings seemed taller and the streets more crowded than I remembered. I didn't want to be anyone's problem. Not now. I was tired of being the one who was left behind, the one who had to sit quietly in the background and wait for people to remember she was still there. The taxi ride was short, but it felt like a journey that spanned lifetimes. The driver didn't say much, and neither did I. We moved through the streets of Portland, passing storefronts with neon lights buzzing in the dark, passing rows of houses with their warm, golden lights spilling out into the night. The city felt alive in a way Wilmington never had. It felt like it was full of people who had purpose, people who had something to do, somewhere to go. I wasn't one of them. I was just a woman trying to find her way in a world that had long since stopped caring. I had looked up a cheap motel before I left Wilmington, just in case. I didn't know what I would find when I got here, but I knew I needed somewhere to stay, somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could think. The motel was small, tucked away on a quiet street, just far enough from the city centre to feel like a world apart. When I walked into the lobby, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and bleach. The clerk barely looked up from the counter when I handed her my ID and cash. "Room 207, she said, handing me a key without ceremony. No smiles, no small talk. Just business. I made my way to the second floor, my footsteps echoing down the narrow hall. The floor creaked under my weight, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that had long since lost its colour. Room 207 was at the end of the hall, and when I opened the door, I found a small, bare room. The bed was narrow, the blanket thin, and there was a single chair in the corner. There was nothing personal here, nothing familiar. It was just a place to sleep, a place to exist for the night. But as I stood there, looking around at the sterile walls and the unmade bed, I realized something. I had never really had a home, not in the way I had always thought of it. Home wasn't the place where you went to rest your head at night. Home was the place where you could be yourself, where you could let your guard down and breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling slightly. I wasn't crying, but I could feel the weight of everything I had lost pressing down on me. I had lost more than just a family. I had lost myself. Over the years, I had given so much of myself to others, first to Adam when he was young, then to Lisa and the grandchildren. I had poured everything I had into them, convinced that if I did enough, loved enough, they would love me back. But they never did. Not in the way I needed. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the walls. But eventually, I took out the small tin of raspberry scones I had packed for the trip. I hadn't had the chance to give them to anyone, and now they felt like a piece of my old life that had been left behind. I wasn't sure why I still had them. They were for Adam's family, after all, and they had no use for them now. But I had made them with love, and that meant something to me. I placed the tin on the small table by the window and stared out at the city. The lights were distant, like stars in a sky I would never touch. The next morning, I woke early, as I always did. The room was cold, and the bed was hard, but I didn't mind. I didn't need comfort right now. I needed clarity. I needed to figure out what had happened, what I had become. I made coffee in the small machine on the nightstand, and as I sat by the window, sipping the bitter brew, I realized that I didn't need to go back. I didn't need to be anyone's problem anymore. At some point, I had stopped being a person. I had become a role, a thing to be managed, a responsibility. My family, who should have been my comfort, had treated me like I was a nuisance. I had become invisible to them, a fixture in their lives that they only remembered when it was convenient. But that wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault that they had forgotten me, that they had left me behind. I had done everything for them. I had given up my time, my energy, my love, and they had taken it all without ever giving anything in return. It was time to stop being invisible. It was time to stop waiting for them to notice me. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their approval. I was still here, still breathing, and that was enough. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that it was up to me to decide. It was up to me to find my own way in this world, to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might actually be able to take control of my own life. I didn't know how it would all unfold, but I knew this: I wasn't going back. Not to the airport lounge, not to the family that had left me behind, not to the life I had been living. I was done being someone's afterthought. I was done being the woman who waited. I was done waiting for permission to live. It was time to start over. And I was ready. The days passed in Portland with a strange rhythm, one that seemed to hold no promise, but also no threat. I woke early every morning, the quiet of the city outside my window offering me a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. There was something about the stillness, the absence of people pressing in on me, that made the weight of the past few years start to lift, if only just a little. The neighborhood I found myself in was nothing remarkable. The houses were small, some old and leaning slightly to the left or right, as if they too had aged and become weary of standing up straight. There were no manicured lawns here, no perfect picket fences or flowers blooming just so. It was a place where people lived without needing to prove anything to anyone. It was a place that felt like it could welcome someone like me, someone who had spent so many years fading into the background of other people's lives. But as the days grew into a week, and then two, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. The silence started to feel heavier. It wasn't a crushing weight, not exactly, but it was there, pressing down on me, like an invisible hand that lingered just a little too long on my shoulder. I found myself questioning everything I had done to get here, everything I had left behind. I didn't regret coming to Portland, not exactly, but I felt the absence of my old life like a deep ache. I would wander the streets during the day, trying to find something, anything, to make sense of the choices I had made. But it was hard to ignore the constant whisper at the back of my mind. What now? I had gone to the park once, just to sit on a bench and watch people walk by. There were mothers with strollers, men walking their dogs, a few teenagers sitting together on the grass, laughing and talking about nothing. They didn't notice me. Not one of them looked at me. And in that moment, I realized that they didn't have to. No one had to notice me anymore. I wasn't someone's obligation, someone's burden to carry, and it felt both freeing and terrifying. I could live as if I didn't matter to anyone, and yet there was a strange comfort in that. It was as though, in stepping away from my family, from the roles I had played for so long, I had become someone else, someone who didn't need anyone's permission to exist. But as the days went on, I began to see that being invisible came with its own kind of cost. I had no one to talk to, no one to check in on me, no one to ask if I was okay. I started to miss the noise, the chatter, the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. I had gotten used to the emptiness, yes, but there were moments when it hit me like a wave, and I felt it deeply. I was alone, really alone, in a way that I hadn't been in a long time. The thought of picking up the phone to call Adam crossed my mind more than once, but each time I stopped myself. What would I say? How could I explain what I was feeling? I had left them behind, and I wasn't sure if that meant I was finally free or just lost. It was in one of these moments of quiet reflection, while I sat at the little diner down the street, that I saw her. Joyce. She wasn't much to look at, really. Older than me by a few years, with a sharp, no-nonsense air about her that immediately made me want to know her. She worked the mornings at the diner, filling coffee cups, taking orders, and, most importantly, never once asking me anything personal. I wasn't a curiosity to her, and that was perhaps the first real kindness I'd received since I'd arrived in Portland. She didn't try to fix me, didn't ask why I was sitting alone, didn't try to make conversation when I didn't feel like talking. But she noticed me. She noticed that I always came in around the same time, that I always ordered the same thing: black coffee, 1 egg over easy, toast with jam. She watched me, but not in a way that made me feel small. The morning I finally spoke to her, I had just finished my shift at the small retail job I had managed to get. The store was a second-hand clothing shop, small but full of treasures. I loved it there, in a way I hadn't expected. The work was easy, and the people who came in were kind, not expecting anything from me except to find something they liked. But when I went into the diner that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I sat down at my usual booth, tucked myself into the corner, and tried to push it out of my mind. Joyce came over with her usual smile, that knowing smile, the one that made me feel like she understood more than she let on. She set my coffee in front of me, then stood there for a moment, watching me. "You doing okay?" she asked, her voice gruff but not unkind. It was the first time anyone had asked me that question in weeks, and something in her tone made me want to answer. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through my chest. "I'm managing," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. She nodded, like she didn't need any more explanation. "You know, sometimes people end up in places like this because they need to be found. Doesn't matter if they're lost or not," she said, turning to go back to the counter. I stared at her retreating back, the words hanging in the air between us. I had no idea what she meant, but I knew in that moment that I wanted to understand. I had been alone for so long, and yet here was someone who didn't see me as broken, someone who didn't feel the need to fix me or offer pity. She just saw me. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, I saw myself. The next few weeks passed quickly, like days often do when they blend together into a single blur of routine. I continued working at the store, continued visiting the diner every morning. Joyce and I exchanged little more than pleasantries, but I began to feel a shift inside myself. I was starting to feel like I could breathe again, like I was taking back the pieces of myself that I had left behind in Wilmington, in that life I had been forced to leave. But the silence, the deep, heavy silence of being alone, never quite left me. It was always there, lurking in the background, especially when I would pass the phone on my nightstand and see the flashing red light. I knew there were messages waiting, probably from Adam, probably from Lisa, asking where I had gone, wondering what had happened to me. But I couldn't bring myself to listen. I couldn't bring myself to hear the voices that had left me behind. Not yet. It wasn't until one morning, when I walked into the diner, that I realized I wasn't as invisible as I thought I was. Joyce wasn't behind the counter. Instead, it was a younger woman, one I didn't recognize. She smiled at me as I sat down. "You Joyce's friend?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. I nodded. "I guess so," I said. "I don't really know her, but we've spoken a few times." The woman smiled knowingly. "She talks about you sometimes, says you're a tough one." I wasn't sure what to make of that, but the idea that someone had noticed, had actually paid attention, made me feel a little lighter. Maybe I wasn't invisible. Not completely. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who could see me for who I was, not who I had been forced to be. But then, as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still just waiting, waiting for a call, waiting for a letter, waiting for something to change. And I knew, in that moment, that the real work wasn't going to be about waiting anymore. It was about making sure that I didn't keep waiting for something I couldn't control. I wasn't invisible, but I was beginning to understand that I didn't need to be seen to be worthy of a life. I just needed to live it. It was a Tuesday morning when I realized I didn't want to disappear, not in the metaphorical way I'd always feared, being forgotten by the people I had raised, the people I had loved more than myself, but in a more immediate, physical way. I was standing by the window of my rented room, watching a woman walk her dog down the block. She wore a pink robe, her back straight, her steps slow but certain. She didn't glance up at my window. She didn't have to. She didn't know me. But something about her presence on the sidewalk felt like a signal, like a gentle reminder that I was still alive, still part of the world, even if only in the smallest way. The sun caught in the glass of the bakery across the street, and I thought, I could walk there. I could buy a scone and say thank you and leave exact change on the counter. I could exist. That thought clung to me as I washed my face, as I made the weak motel coffee, as I carefully folded the blanket I hadn't slept under because the room was too warm. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not in the usual way. Not of dying or being alone or forgotten. I was afraid of wasting time, of letting the rest of my life be defined by the people who had chosen to treat me like a guest in their story, like a cameo, like a figure to step around politely but never invite in. I had spent so many years being useful, baking birthday cakes, paying for braces, babysitting during date nights, only to find that usefulness has an expiration date. I had expired. And now I could either fade or I could change. That morning, I walked, slowly at first. My hips murmured and my knees creaked, but I didn't stop. I passed houses with chipped paint and porches cluttered with flower pots and bikes. I passed a park where a father sat on a bench, his toddler clambering up the slide the wrong way, giggling. No one looked at me, but no one pushed me away either. I was just a woman walking, and that was enough. I found the bakery, small, with a hand-painted sign and a window full of golden pastries. The woman behind the counter had flour on her apron and a kind smile. When I handed her exact change for a blueberry scone, she looked up and said, "You're not from around here, are you?" And for the first time in a long time, I didn't flinch. I said, "I used to be, a long time ago." She nodded. "Well then, welcome back." That sentence landed softly, like a wool blanket over cold shoulders. I wasn't sure I was back. I wasn't sure I belonged anywhere. But it felt warm. I asked about housing listings, and she pointed me to a corkboard by the door. There were handwritten notes pinned to it: dog walking, piano lessons, used bikes for sale. Then one caught my eye. Room for rent, For quiet lady, private room, shared kitchen, house safe, no nonsense, $400 per month. Call Joyce. The words were in block letters, written in firm, unsentimental handwriting. Not desperate, not cheerful, just real. I took a photo of the number, thanked the woman, and walked back to the park. I found a bench in the sun, ate my scones slowly, and dialed the number. The voice that answered was gravelly, suspicious. "Yeah?" she said. "I'm calling about the room," I said. There was a long pause. "How old are you?" 77. Another pause. "You clean?" "Yes." "No boyfriends?" I laughed quietly. "Not in a long time." She didn't laugh back. "You can come by at 4, 2185 East Stafford. Bring cash for the first week." Then she hung up. The house was blue, faded, the porch paint peeling. A wind chime tapped against the siding like spoons clinking together. Joyce opened the door in slippers, a cigarette in one hand, a tabby cat curling around her ankles. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes narrowed. "You the old lady?" "I suppose I am," I said. She stepped aside. "Come in then. Let's see if we can tolerate each other." Inside, the house smelled like lavender and onions. Not unpleasant, just lived in. Books were stacked in corners. A crocheted blanket draped over the back of a faded armchair. The room she showed me was upstairs, small but clean. A twin bed, a nightstand, a dresser with mismatched knobs. But the window was wide, and sunlight poured in as if it had been waiting for me. "It's fine," I said. "100 a week," Joyce said. "Cash only. No checks, no sob stories." I handed her 5 20s from the envelope I'd been carrying in my coat lining since Wilmington. She took them without counting. "You hungry?" she asked. "I could eat." She made grilled cheese and heated tomato soup from a can. We ate in silence at the small kitchen table under a yellowed ceiling fan. She didn't ask where I was from. She didn't ask why I was alone. She only said, "I hate eating alone," and I understood. That night, I unpacked. 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my medications, and a paperback novel I had never finished. I folded each item slowly, placing them in the dresser drawers like I was laying bricks in a new foundation. This wasn't much, but it was mine. I turned off the light and lay in the narrow bed. The house creaked and groaned around me, the way old houses do when they settle. I could hear Joyce talking softly to the cat in the next room. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The next morning, I made coffee in the little pot on the stove before Joyce got up. The kitchen already felt familiar, like it didn't belong to people who only remembered me when they needed something. I sat with my cup at the table, watching the light change on the floor. No one called. No one texted. I didn't check. That day, I walked again. A longer walk this time. I found another cafe, this one with a chalkboard sign that read, "Help wanted. Morning shift. Apply inside." I stood outside for a moment. I hadn't worked in 15 years, but I wasn't a stranger to early mornings and coffee pots. I stepped inside. A young woman in an apron was wiping down the counter. I asked, "You hiring?" She looked up, surprised. "You want to apply?" I nodded. "Yes." She called to the back, and a woman with a messy bun and a name tag that read Heather came out. "You have experience?" she asked. "I've raised 3 kids, run a household, and made breakfast every day for 40 years. I can pour coffee, carry plates, and I don't call in sick." She looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. You make it through that. We'll talk. That night, I ironed my blouse, the only one I had that still held a crease. I lay in bed with a sense of something new, pulsing just beneath my skin. Not excitement exactly. More like readiness. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was walking. I was beginning. Not towards someone else's plan for me, but towards something that was quietly, stubbornly mine. The life I had left behind in that airport lounge wasn't my last chapter. It was just the last time I let someone else write it for me. I didn't know how much time had passed when the phone call came. It was one of those mornings when I'd already made it through half a shift at the cafe, moving in rhythm with the rush, wiping down counters, refilling cups, memorizing orders, and listening to Heather bark orders at me with the same sharp efficiency she had when I first started. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday, though I had stopped keeping track. It didn't matter anymore. Days were just days now, not things to be marked off a calendar. My days were mine to fill, to decide how they would unfold, and I had learned to take my time with them. The bell on the door jingled as it always did, but this time it didn't sound the same. The noise in the cafe, the clinking of cups, and the hum of the espresso machine seemed distant as I fumbled for my phone in my apron pocket. It had buzzed 3 times in quick succession, a pattern that I had started to recognize. It was Lisa. She had left a message, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. The first message came through clear, tight, with worry. "Mum, where are you? We've been trying to reach you. Adam is frantic. Please call us. We're just worried about you. This isn't funny anymore." The words hit me like a slap, the panic in her voice making my stomach tighten. There was no apology in her tone, no recognition of what had happened. Only the same frantic concern that had always been their way of controlling everything. The second message came a few minutes later, Adam's voice now colder, more controlled. "Mom, we've been trying to call. Where are you? This isn't funny. Just tell us where you are. We're trying to help you, but you're making it impossible. Don't make this harder than it has to be." His words were clipped, sharp. It wasn't concern. It was frustration, anger that I wasn't playing the part they had set for me. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about how my absence reflected on them. They were worried about the disruption to their carefully constructed lives. They weren't concerned about me. The third message came just as I was slipping the phone back into my pocket, and I could already tell it would be the same as the others. But this one had a different tone. It was Kieran. His voice was quieter, tentative, like he wasn't sure if he should even be leaving the message. "Grandma, I don't know where you are, but I'm looking for you. I miss you. Please just let me know you're okay." His voice cracked at the end, and for a moment I stood frozen, my hands gripping the counter as the rest of the cafe carried on around me. Kieran had always been the one who never needed anything from me except my presence. When he was younger, he would come over to the house and ask me to play checkers with him, or sit and talk about things that didn't matter to anyone else. Things like his favorite book, or the birdhouse he was building in the backyard. He was the only one who ever made me feel like I wasn't just there to do things for other people. He made me feel like I was enough, just as I was. But that was the last time I had been enough for anyone. Kieran's message left me standing at the counter with my breath caught in my throat, my hands shaking slightly as I realized how far I had fallen out of their lives. How much time had passed without me even realizing it. It wasn't just that they had abandoned me. It was that I had abandoned them. I had made the choice to leave, to step out of that role they had built for me, And even though I knew it was the right choice, a part of me still felt guilty. It was a guilt that crept in like a fog, filling the spaces between the silence, reminding me of what I had left behind. I wasn't ready to listen to the rest of the messages, and I wasn't ready to call them back. Not yet. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to come back, to apologize, to make everything right again. They wanted me to return to the woman they had controlled, the woman who had quietly done everything they asked without question. But I wasn't that woman anymore, and I wasn't going back. I couldn't. For the next few days, I avoided the phone. I didn't want to hear the guilt in their voices, the false concern that would only make me feel small again. I didn't want to listen to Lisa try to manipulate me into coming back. Didn't want to hear Adam tell me how reasonable they were being, how understanding they were, and how much they just wanted me to be safe. They weren't interested in my safety. They were interested in having control over me again. But then, one afternoon, something changed. It was the first time I had felt the weight of their absence so keenly. I was walking down the street, my hands tucked into my coat pockets against the wind, and I passed a woman with a stroller. She was laughing with her child, her face glowing with that effortless joy that I hadn't known in years. It was the first time in a long time that I realized how much I had been giving up. Not just in leaving them behind, but in staying silent, in pretending that the life they had created for me was enough. I had let myself be erased, had let their expectations of me define who I was for so long, and now I was finally standing outside of it, able to see it for what it was. A cage, a trap, a role I had been forced into, and one I had willingly stayed in, thinking I had no choice. That evening, as I sat in my little room, I made a decision. I was done hiding. I was done running from them, done trying to protect them from the truth of who I was now. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about taking back my voice, taking back my dignity. I would call them. I would answer their questions, but I would do it on my terms. I would not apologize. I would not explain myself. I had made my choice, and now it was time to make them see that I was not someone to be controlled anymore. The next morning, after a restless night of tossing and turning, I turned my phone on. There were a dozen missed calls from Adam and Lisa, messages from Kieran that I hadn't listened to yet. But I knew what I had to do. I called Adam first. I let it ring twice before he picked up, his voice clipped and tight, as if he had been waiting for the moment to explode. "Martha," he said, his voice strained. "Where the hell have you been? We've been trying to call you for days. This isn't funny. You've worried the hell out of Lisa and me. You're not making this easy on anyone." His words felt like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let him push me back into that role. Not now. Not ever again. "I'm fine, Adam," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I'm safe. I'm okay. I don't need anyone to worry about me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, trying to figure out what to say next. I knew he was angry, confused, hurt. But it wasn't my problem anymore. I wasn't responsible for how he felt. "You can't just disappear like this, Mom," he finally said. "You can't just walk away and expect everything to be okay." "I'm not asking you to understand, Adam," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm just telling you that I'm done. I'm not coming back. I'm not going to pretend that everything's fine when it's not. I'm not going to keep being your problem. I'm living my own life now." There was another long pause. I could hear the crackle of the phone line, the distance between us growing wider by the second. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mom," Adam said finally, his voice low. "But I'll say this. If you ever change your mind, If you ever decide you want to be part of this family again, you know where to find us." "I don't need to be part of your family again," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm part of my own life now, and that's enough for me." When I ended the call, I didn't feel relief, but I didn't feel guilt either. I felt something new, something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. And though I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew it was the only road I could walk, alone, and finally, unapologetically, myself. I didn't know when it happened. There wasn't a specific moment that I could point to, a single event that made me realize that I had truly, finally, taken back control. It wasn't one phone call, or one letter, or one dramatic decision. It was something quieter, something that crept up on me slowly, like the way the light changes over the course of a day without you even realizing it until the shadows start to lengthen and the warmth in the air feels different. By the time the lawyer arrived, I had stopped feeling like I was caught in some kind of web of confusion. The days had blurred into one another, and I had started to find a rhythm to my life. Work at the cafe had become a steady rhythm, one that grounded me in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I was waking up early, preparing the diner for the morning rush, finding comfort in the predictability of it all. I had carved out a space for myself in this small world, and in that world, I didn't feel small anymore. Joyce had become a part of my days, not in the way that family does, but in a quieter way, a more honest way. We weren't friends in the traditional sense. We didn't share every detail of our lives, and we didn't need to. She simply existed, and so did I, and somehow that was enough. Her gruff demeanor didn't bother me. I had come to appreciate her no-nonsense approach to life, her bluntness that didn't try to sugarcoat anything. I understood it. It was survival. She wasn't pretending to be anything she wasn't, and that made her a rare kind of person in my experience. But I didn't realize how much I had settled into my new life until the letter came. It wasn't just any letter. It was thick, official-looking, with a return address that I immediately recognized: Wilmington. It had been sitting in the small wicker basket on the counter of the cafe where we left our mail for days before I picked it up, too busy to pay attention to anything outside of my new routine. But as soon as I saw it, I knew. I didn't even need to open it to know what was inside. It was from Adam. His words had always been like a dull hammer, relentless and heavy, trying to pound me into submission, trying to break me down until I gave in to whatever he wanted. I could already feel the anger in his handwriting, the frustration, the same old excuses, the same words that had always made me feel less than I was, less than I deserved. I had felt it before, even when he hadn't spoken them. But now, it was different. Now, I wasn't that woman anymore. I opened the envelope slowly, carefully, knowing that I wasn't going to rush through this. The first page was filled with the kind of neat, controlled handwriting that I knew all too well. There were no words of apology, no words of concern about me, about my safety, about what had happened to me. It was all about how they were doing, about how they were hurt by my absence, about how they couldn't understand why I had chosen to leave. It was the same tired, manipulative narrative I had heard too many times in my life. The letter had been written in the language of guilt, of manipulation, and it was so familiar that it almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I didn't let myself. Instead, I read the whole thing slowly, with a calmness that surprised me. There were the usual accusations, the ones that I had expected, how I had caused all this trouble, how I was the one who had decided to make everything so complicated, how I was the one who had chosen to hurt them by leaving. There was a mention of Lisa's tears, Adam's anger, and the children's confusion. But there was something else, something that stood out in the middle of all the guilt-tripping. At the very end of the letter, after all the anger and frustration, there was a line that was meant to sound like a concession, like an offer to let me return to the fold. "We're willing to talk, Mom," it said, "but only if you're ready to be reasonable." It hit me then, and it hit me hard. There it was, the final proof. I had been right all along. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about love. This was about control. This was about Adam and Lisa thinking that they had the right to determine my life, to tell me how to live it, to decide when I could be a part of it. But I wasn't their property. I wasn't their problem to fix. I wasn't their burden. I was my own person, and I had made my choice. I wasn't going back. I folded the letter carefully, the paper crinkling under my fingers, as if it were a thing I could physically crush. I didn't need to read it again. I had already heard it all before, in different words, in different times, in different ways. It wasn't new. It was just more of the same. I placed the letter back in the envelope and shoved it into my bag. I didn't want to keep it. I didn't want to look at it. It was the last tie, the last connection to the life I had walked away from, and it needed to be severed once and for all. I hadn't planned on burning it. I hadn't planned on making any kind of spectacle out of it. But when I got home that evening, I found myself standing in front of the stove, holding the envelope in my hands, staring at it. I didn't need it. I didn't need their words or their attempts to control me. I had nothing to prove. I was finally free. I took a match from the drawer and lit it. The small flame flickered for a moment, then grew steady, and I held it to the edge of the envelope. The paper curled and blackened, and as it did, I felt something inside me burn away too, something that had been holding me in place, holding me back. The flames danced for a moment, casting strange shadows on the walls of my small kitchen, and then they were gone. The letter was gone, nothing but ashes in the sink. It was over. It had always been over, but now it was real. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to understand. I wasn't waiting for them to let me go. I was already gone, and I was never going back. I didn't tell Joyce what I had done. I didn't need to. It was my decision, my life, and I didn't need anyone to validate it. The next morning, I got up early, like I always did, and I put on my apron, my old blouse, and I went to the cafe. The bell above the door jingled, and I walked through it with my head held high, knowing that the world was mine to shape now. There was no guilt, no shame, just the quiet, steady work of living. Heather noticed first. She had a way of seeing things without asking. She handed me a fresh towel and a cup of coffee, and after a moment, she said, "You look lighter." I smiled and nodded. She didn't ask why, and I didn't tell her. But I knew. I had made a choice. I had let go of something that had been weighing me down for far too long. And in that moment, I felt free. It wasn't the dramatic, triumphant kind of freedom that they had always expected. It wasn't the kind that demanded applause or recognition. It was quieter, subtler. But it was mine, and that was enough. I went home that night, changed out of my work clothes, and sat on the porch with Joyce. The air was cooler than it had been, and we both wrapped ourselves in blankets. The wind rustled the leaves, and the world felt softer, gentler somehow. Joyce didn't say much, but then she didn't need to. She knew. We sat in the quiet, letting the day slip away, letting the moment stretch out between us like an old memory. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that this was all I needed. I didn't need Adam. I didn't need Lisa. I didn't need anyone who didn't see me for who I was, who I had always been. I was done being what they wanted me to be. I was done being what they needed me to be. I was myself now. And that was enough. The days after that quiet moment with Joyce seemed to stretch on, though they didn't feel long. The hours passed in an easy rhythm, a kind of quiet peace that I hadn't known in years. Each morning I woke up with the sun, feeling the warmth filter through the curtains, and each evening I ended the day with the same sense of fulfillment, knowing I had done something that mattered to me, not to anyone else, not to the expectations I had once lived under, but to me. That was enough. It was all I needed now. The job at the cafe had become a routine, one I welcomed. I had learned the names of regular customers, their orders, the stories they carried with them every morning as they sat at the same table by the window, sipping coffee and reading the paper. Some of them talked to me, others didn't. But that didn't matter. I was a part of their day, just as they had become a part of mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Not like I had felt back in Wilmington, where I had been relegated to the background of everyone's life, seen but not truly noticed, acknowledged only when it was convenient. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was my life, and it felt like it was finally mine. Then, one afternoon, I found myself sitting on the small porch of the house, staring out into the street as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. It was just another quiet moment, one that felt as ordinary as any other. But something had shifted within me. I wasn't sure when it happened, but I realized then that I had come full circle, that the journey I had taken from the confusion of leaving Wilmington to the quiet acceptance of my new life was complete. I had started as someone who was running away, who was seeking to escape the life that had been imposed upon me, but now I was someone who had found a place for herself, a place where I was no longer hiding or waiting for approval. I wasn't waiting for anyone to find me, to recognize my worth. I had already found myself, and that was enough. It was then that I realized the truth of it all. I hadn't just left Wilmington and my family. I had left the woman I had once been, the one who had defined herself by the needs and demands of others, the woman who had accepted her role, her place in the world, without question. I had left her behind, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of self-preservation. I had stepped out of the role they had cast me in, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the parts of myself that had been buried under years of silence and sacrifice. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't whole, but I was becoming something that felt more real than the woman I had been before, the one who had bent and twisted herself into whatever shape was needed to fit into their lives. There were moments when I thought of them, of Adam, of Lisa, of the grandkids, and I felt the faintest pang of longing, but it wasn't the same longing that had once gripped me, the desperation to be seen, to be needed, to be loved in the way I had always imagined love should look. It was something softer now, a quiet ache for the things that could have been, for the family that could have understood. But that longing wasn't the whole of me. It was just a small part of the life I had left behind, a piece that no longer had the power to define who I was or who I would become. One day, as I was heading home after work, I passed by the small flower shop on the corner that I had walked past a dozen times without giving it much thought. But this time, something caught my eye, a small bunch of wildflowers, daisies and lavender, tied together with a simple string. It wasn't much, but it was beautiful in its own way. I stood there for a moment, looking at the arrangement, and then I found myself walking inside the shop. The woman behind the counter smiled as I approached. "Are you buying flowers for someone special?" she asked, and I realized, almost with surprise, that I wasn't. The flowers were for me, for the woman I had become, for the person I had learned to love again. I bought the bouquet, walked home, and placed it on the kitchen table, where the colours seemed to brighten the entire room. The next day, after I had arranged the flowers in a small vase, I went for a walk. It wasn't far, just down the block and around the corner, but it was enough. It felt like more than a walk. It felt like a journey, one that had taken me years to complete, but one that I had taken on my own terms. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone would notice, wondering if they would come to find me and bring me back into their lives. I was free now. Free to walk at my own pace, to take in the world as it was, not as I had been told it should be. I didn't need permission anymore. I didn't need their approval. I found myself at the park, sitting on a bench that overlooked the small pond in the centre. The air was cool, the leaves rustling in the trees above me, and for a moment I closed my eyes and simply listened. It felt like the world was breathing with me, like everything was moving in time with my own heartbeat. I wasn't alone in the way I had been before, not in the way that had made me feel invisible and small. I was part of something bigger now, part of the quiet rhythm of the world that moved on, no matter what had happened in the past. In that moment, I realized that there was no need to go back. There was no need to prove anything to anyone. I had already proven it to myself. I had reclaimed my life, my voice, my dignity. It wasn't about making them understand or making them see what I had become. It wasn't about forcing anyone to accept me on my own terms. I didn't need that. What I needed was what I already had. A life I had built for myself, one that was quietly, stubbornly mine. When I returned home that evening, I didn't feel any sense of closure, not in the way I had imagined. There was no dramatic moment, no final confrontation with Adam or Lisa. There was just the simple reality of the life I had created. The flowers were still on the table, their petals soft and delicate, a reminder of the peace I had found in this small corner of the world. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The phone didn't ring anymore. I had stopped checking it, stopped wondering if they would ever reach out again. It didn't matter. I had learned to live without the constant pull of their expectations. I had learned to stand on my own, to trust myself, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I was no longer the woman they had tried to shape, the woman who had waited for their approval, for their permission. I was me, and that was all I ever needed to be. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found that I didn't need to look back. I didn't need to wait for them to find me or to make things right. I had already made things right for myself. I was finally free, finally whole, and that freedom, that peace, was mine to keep. And so, I moved forward, quietly, slowly, but always on my own terms.